Hey everyone, welcome to Slurs and Stereotypes. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on the N-word. Before we discuss our main article for today, let's start by discussing some important points regarding the professional scholarly study of slurs. Importantly, throughout the course, slurs will be mentioned but not used. The use mentioned distinction is going to be very important here. So, for example, reporters often mention in their reports what other people have said without being committed to saying those things for themselves. For example, a reporter might mention that a bride said, "I do," without that reporter also being committed to saying, "I do." So language scientists, like reporters, will mention slurs for scholarly purposes without using slurs for derogation, for example. When writing about slurs, the scholarly convention is to place these words within quotation marks or in italics to indicate that these words are being mentioned rather than used. During certain contexts, such as during short lectures over YouTube that a casual viewer or passerby might inappropriately decontextualize, we may use substitute words for slurs. Such substitutes can be in the form of N word, C word, and S word. And these are replacements for slurs in their full form. And in the slide, you can see that I've used N word to replace this slur here, C word to replace this slur here, and S word to replace this slur here. So importantly, because on videos, we can easily decontextualize a brief part of a lecture, and like if I'm giving a lecture on the N word, for example, it's very easy for a slice of that lecture to be decontextualized, like posted on TikTok, for example, right? So what we don't want is just a 1 second clip of me saying the N word on TikTok, right? So for the purposes of a lecture like today, I'm going to use words like N word or C word or S word. Okay, so that way my usage or my mentioning of that slur is not easily decontextualized and misunderstood. However, having said that, it's very important for scholarly purposes, especially in journal publications, that we include the full instance of the slur. So, for example, there may be variations in the usage of a slur between in-group and out-group members, right? So we see that the N-word, that there's a variation of the N-word that's used by in-group speakers and another variation of the N-word that's used by out-group speakers. And if we just used N-word instead of spelling out the full slur, we would fail to appreciate the distinctions between in-group and out-group variants. So for that reason, when we're writing articles, scholarly articles, especially if it's concerning semantics, like what do these words mean, right? Then we want to be very careful and include the full slur, okay, in order to track any important distinctions in the usage. Okay, and not just between in-group and out-group usage, but also there may be variability over time. Okay, we might see that the slur changes its spelling over time, or we might just want to track certain changes through time. Okay, so that being said, right, draw upon current scholarly conventions and exercise your best judgment when we're working on slurs. Okay. Be as informative as possible, but also always understand the audience that you're speaking to, making sure that you're not offending anyone, and so on. Okay. In the context of class that's not published online, for example, on YouTube, we sort of are working on a common assumption, which I've already explicitly stated in the course syllabus, right? That we're only mentioning slurs and we're going to treat these words in a very professional manner. Okay. All right. Some questions to think about, both for today's lecture, as well as we continue reading different articles throughout the course. Okay. One of the questions is, what are slurs? How can these words be systematically differentiated from other kinds of words or speech acts? How do slurs, for example, like the N word, how do they differ from purely descriptive words like car or American, which are neutral and descriptive? How are slurs also different from highly effective words like ouch, yikes? We want to try to come up with some properties that slurs have that descriptives and expressive words don't have. Or we want to think of some rules or conventions for the use of slurs that differ from the use and conventions of other kinds of words. So another question is, what are the rules or conventions for their use? As language scholars, we want to articulate the unique properties of slurs as well as the rules for their use in society, okay, both by in-group speakers and by out-group speakers. What do language transmitters use slurs to do? And I put language transmitters because speakers emphasizes the fact that language is often spoken. For example, I'm speaking English right now. However, I always want to make sure that we appreciate that language users include sign language users as well. Okay, so language is not purely a spoken phenomenon, and that's why I just have speakers here. And out here, transmitters and recipients. This is just to be more inclusive in our discussion of language users. Okay. So what do language transmitters use slurs to do? When someone uses a slur, why are they using that slur? Why would someone ever use the N word as opposed to another word? Both, that question can be asked for an outgroup member, like why do outgroup members use slurs to target African Americans? Another question is, why do in-group members use slurs to target African Americans? Another related question is, what do language recipients or listeners, receivers understand by the use of slurs? Okay, so there's one question about what are speakers doing when they're using slurs. Another is, how do listeners interpret slur usage? Right? How do I know that a particular usage of the N word is an in-group or out-group usage? How do I know that a particular usage is a pejorative or derogatory, or a reclaimed or a reappropriated variant of that word? Okay, we want to try to think of some strategies for understanding when we can identify derogatory versus non-derogatory usage of a slur. And a goal, one of our goals, we have several goals, but one of our goals is to develop a general account or theory of slurs that fits the facts of their natural language usage. So we will have to investigate how slurs are actually used in order to model or provide an informative account of what slurs are and how they function. Okay, if we want to give an account of how a car functions, right, we need to understand some facts about how cars work. All right, if we want to give an account of how the heart functions, we need to understand some facts about how the heart works. Similarly, if we're going to give an informed account of how slurs work, right, how are they used to derogate and harm people? Also, how is it possible for them to be reclaimed and reappropriated, right? In order to give a nice, full, informative account of slur usage, we're going to have to start off with some careful investigative work. Okay, we need to do some empirically oriented work to understand how slurs are actually being used in natural language contexts. Okay, and that will help us build an accurate model for how slurs are used. By investigating how slurs are actually used in natural language contexts, we will also become sensitive to relevant questions and points for further investigation. So, for example, as we learn more about slur reappropriation or reclamation, we will then be better positioned to ask more nuanced questions about slur reclamation or reappropriation. Okay, so the purpose of doing empirical work is several, right? One purpose of empirical work is so that way we can develop a more accurate and nuanced account, theoretical model, okay? Another purpose of doing empirically oriented work is that it will help raise more questions for us, right? As we learn about slurs, their variable usages, it'll help us just ask more interesting questions about slurs. Okay, we're going to start off thinking about the N word, but we can ask, do other slurs work like the N word, or are other slurs different? Is there something unique about the N word compared to other slurs, or does studying the N word help provide a model for how all slurs work? Okay, and there's just lots of questions, as we'll see as we continue through the course. We will be raising as many questions as we will be addressing. So these are just some interesting questions to be thinking about throughout the article today, and as we continue throughout the rest of the articles in this course. All right, so one of the assigned readings / video lectures that was assigned for this lecture was by Randall Kennedy on the N-word. So the N-word is a paradigm racial insult. So it makes sense to begin our study on slurs with the most well-known paradigm slur. This slur is often considered the most obscene word in the English language. It's considered the most offensive slur. This is also a slur that's not only the most salient, shocking, and offensive, but also the slur that has the most research done on it. Okay, so if we're gonna study slurs, it makes sense to start with the slur that has been the most well-researched. Okay, that way we can understand how this slur came about. We can understand its paradigm use. We can understand its other usages. And this can help serve as a model for us for how slurs in general might work. Okay, as we become experts on the N-word, it'll help us become experts on other types of words that function in the way that the N-word functions. And we'll see that many slurs function in this way, even though they may not be as salient or considered as offensive as the N-word. So we're interested in the N-word because it's well-researched, also because it's considered the most offensive or derogatory. Also, Kennedy makes an interesting point in that for certain ethnic or racial groups for which we don't have a slur, we often use this slur to generate new slurs. Okay, so Kennedy points out here, quote, "It is the only epithet I know of that has generated other epithets." So, for instance, when people want to heap contempt upon Native Americans, they call them this. When people want to heap contempt upon the Irish, they call them the ends of Europe. When people want to heap contempt on Arabs, they call them sand ends. So the N-word serves as this golden standard for racial insult. So clearly the N-word is in its paradigm most common form, or its most well-known salient form. It has a a derogatory, dehumanizing usage. Okay. Highly offensive. Okay. I mean, it's not hard to Google the N-word and find, excuse me, violence perpetrated over the usage of this word. Okay. Both out-group members using the N-word as they perpetuate violence towards African-American targets, but also that when this word is used towards African-Americans, that they will often retaliate as this word is being hurled against them, okay, in sort of a response. Okay, so one thing that we see about slurs is that they're in their paradigm pejorative, dehumanizing usage, people usually use slurs as a part of a violent action. Okay, it's a sort of linguistic violence that accompanies physical violence in this usage. Okay, and we see that not only do speakers use it this way, but targets understand it this way as well. Okay, in that they become defensive and will retaliate in response to slurs being used against them. And this isn't just for the N-word, although it includes the N-word. But for example, Asian Americans that have slurs used against them will also retaliate, right? This is just to point out that people don't like to be dehumanized or have slurs used against them. Okay, so of course, we want to highlight the important fact that slurs have a paradigm dehumanizing usage. And in my 2013 article, I distinguished between 3 different usages of slurs, and one, the first usage, I call the paradigm derogatory usage. Okay, and this is the first usage because when we think of slurs, we're thinking of them as bad words that are used to target ethnic, racial, social groups and dehumanize them, make them inferior, right, on the basis of their group membership. Okay. All right, now that we've acknowledged the paradigm derogatory, dehumanizing usage of the N-word, right, and we agree on all sides that this is something that must be accounted for when we're studying slurs, right? Like it would be a poor model of slurs if I was unable to account for the derogatory usage, because that's the most salient usage of slurs. Okay, so we want to be able to explain why slurs are derogatory. However, our analysis of slurs would be limited and incomplete if we only focused on the derogatory usage. Okay. In other words, even though the N-word is considered the paradigm racial insult, it is not always or exclusively used for insults or for derogation. Okay. So here we're seeing some of the reasons why this is such an interesting thing to study. On the one hand, slurs are the most offensive forms, the most offensive words in the language, or the most offensive kinds of speech acts, right? But also on the other hand, they're not necessarily used in that way, right? Even though they're the most offensive words, they can also be used for other purposes and in a non-derogatory way. So for example, Randall Kennedy, who's a law professor at Harvard University, as well as a leading scholar on slurs, Kennedy says, quote, "The term would be interesting and worthy of study if it were only used as an insult. If that was the only way in which it was used, it would still warrant more study. But it's even more interesting because that's not the only way it's used. This word has been used in a wide variety of ways. And one way in which it's used is as a term of affectionate salutation. I certainly have friends and members of my family, for that matter, who have embraced me lovingly with the term N-word. Good to see you, my N. As a sociological matter, I think it's irrefutable that there are people who use the term as a gesture of affection. Okay. So this is also an important point to acknowledge. Okay. What we don't want to do, right, as language scientists, as cognitive scientists, is blind ourselves to sociological matters of fact because of prior theoretical commitments, right? I don't want to use my a priori commitments of how I think slurs work to blind me to facts that should be explained, right? Although it would be easier, for example, to just explain slurs as only having a derogatory usage, right? If I just want to say, well, slurs just always dehumanize, that makes my job as a linguist and cognitive scientist much easier, right? All I have to do is just explain, well, slurs are used to hurt people, right? They're used as part of hate speech, right? And I can just give a uniform account of slurs and fit that into an account of, dehumanization, outgroup, stereotypes, and whatnot. Okay, it's a simpler story to tell if I only want to think of slurs as having a single uniform function. Okay. However, although that makes my job as a theorist simpler, my theory lacks explanatory power now, because what I'm doing is my theory can only account for derogatory usages of slurs. And now when I come to phenomena like this, in-group usages, of which this is very widespread and common, my count no longer can explain this, right? If I'm saying something like, well, what slurs are forms of hate speech that are only used to derogate and dehumanize, well, then it becomes perplexing how they can be used in a reappropriative or reclaimed manner, right? So what we want to do is, as we build our theory of slurs, our theory of language, we want to tool it, construct it in such a way that it'll accommodate this type of behavior as well. Okay. Another way to say this is, one of the interesting things about slurs that our account should be able to explain is the possibility of reclamation. Okay. How it's possible for slurs to be reclaimed or reappropriated. Okay. And notice that this will also add more flexibility to our understanding of language, right? Instead of thinking of words as being always and only negative, or always and only positive, or always and only neutral, right? We can now start to think about how words like a slur can change from being neutral to negative, and then from negative to neutral to positive, right? And we can start asking questions about how the meaning and valence of words change. Okay. All right. So one thing that we just want to flag here, like we flagged on the previous slide, is that not only is the N-word used in a derogatory way, but it's also used in a non-derogatory way. And we want to be able to understand what's the systematic, what's the rule that allows for us to distinguish between derogatory and non-derogatory usages, right? Is there something about the word? Maybe the word is different. Maybe when the word is used in a derogatory way, it has a different spelling or a sound than when it's used in a non-derogatory way. Maybe it's not the word that's different. Maybe it's the context that's different, right? Maybe it's because the slur is used in a hurtful context that gives it its negative valence, whereas when it's used in a supportive context, it acquires a positive valence. Or maybe it's related to speaker identity. So when a certain type of person uses the relevant slur, it has a pejorative meaning, but when a different type of person uses it, it has a non-pejorative meaning. Okay, we want to be able to ask these different questions, okay, and come up with some systematic rules for how speakers know when to use the slur and how recipients know how to understand the use of a slur. Okay, how we can coordinate meaning and use. Okay. All right. So other scholars, such as Jabari Asim, have also devoted full-length treatments to the study of the N-word, investigating both the derogatory and non-derogatory usage of this term. So in this course, we therefore take it as a sociological fact worth explaining that people use slurs in a complex variety of ways, some derogatory and some non-derogatory. In this course, we want to examine the systematic principles that guide derogatory and non-derogatory uses of slurs, as well as the kinds of impact that these different uses have on language users and targets. As cognitive scientists and language theorists, we want to provide a model for how slurs actually work, both derogatorily and non-derogatorily. So we can also explain their use in outgroup and in-group behavior, okay? This is not only important as linguists, but also as cognitive scientists, right? Because as cognitive scientists, we want to gain insight into not just the meaning of words, but cognitive function and behavior. And so in order to fully understand in-group and out-group behavior, in order to understand what's going on with derogation as well as reclamation, right? In order to understand these different types of cognitive processes and social behaviors, we need to understand how slurs are used both derogatorily and non-derogatorily. Okay, and I've been arguing this point for over 10 years now, because early on in the beginning, there was almost an exclusive emphasis on their derogatory usage. And I've been pointing out that we have so much to learn by investigating their non-derogatory usage as well. Okay. This also, by studying the non-derogatory usage, this not only helps us gain insight into slurs, better insight into slurs, but also better insight into the nature of language and cognitive processing. Okay. All right, so some philosophers of language deny that slurs can have any non-derogatory uses and argue that scholars such as Kennedy, Asim, and many others are confused by their own uses of the N-word, or that these uses, these in-group uses, are somehow symptomatic of internalized self-hatred. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly in passing earlier, in order to make our theories simpler, we might just refuse to acknowledge the various usages of slurs. We might just focus on the derogatory use and say that's the only real use, right? Other scholars that say that there's an in-group use, they don't really know what they're talking about, right? So this has been an approach that's been pretty popular in philosophy, okay? Unfortunately, okay? So for example, there's many philosophers that adopt this approach, and I discussed this in my published work. For example, you can see my article, The Semantics of Slurs, A Refutation of Pure Expressivism. But another example can be found by journalists and other authors in popular media. For example, Ronald Fitton in the Seattle Times writes the following, quote, "The use of racial slurs intraracially perpetuates within the group all of its negative history and on some levels is a form of self-hatred." Okay, so what's unfortunate about this approach, right, by Ronald Fitton and others, is that whereas many uh, intelligent speakers from the African American community have clearly stated that the N word is used in their community in a non-pejorative way, right? So, for example, we have a law professor at Harvard University who's a slur scholar and has published many books on this topic, right? Randall Kennedy has said this, that the slur has a non-derogatory usage in the African American community. Just people like Ronald Fitton are just saying, well, they don't really know what they're talking about, right? And so think about this methodologically. How can a layperson, right, say based on their a priori assumptions of how slurs work, challenge a law professor and slur scholar, right, on their own reports of how these words are used in their own community, right? It would be like saying, going to, just going to any expert of their language, like going to a speaker of ASL and saying, well, they don't really know what they're doing when they're communicating in ASL, okay? Or going to any speaker of their dialect and saying they don't really understand what they're doing when they use language, okay, as an outgroup observer, right? We see methodologically that this is very weak. And what we end up having is scholars just denying not just reclaimed usages of the N-word, but they're committed to denying all such usages, right? That intraracial or intragroup usages are really a form of self-hatred. So we'll see that not this reclaimed usages not only apply to the N-word, but apply to many, many varieties of slurs. Okay, I've published distinct articles on slurs that target Asian Americans, and we see reclamation there as well. Slurs against Mexican Americans, those slurs are also reclaimed, okay? Slurs against women, also reclaimed, right? Slurs against homosexuals, also reclaimed, right? So what we see is that many slurs that target social groups, those slurs are reclaimed by members of those groups, okay? And what we're doing if we're denying the possibility of in-group usage or reclamation is we're saying that all those people, right, don't know what they're doing. And what we end up doing is this is no longer in an explanatorily powerful position. What we're doing is we're just refusing to explain is what we're doing, okay? And what I'm trying to say here is that this is a weak position to be in. It's an explanatory weak position is because we don't have anything intelligent to say about what's going on with that behavior, okay? And instead of just saying they don't know what they're doing with their language, it's just all self-hatred, right? We need some data or evidence to support that rather than just conjuring it up from the armchair a priori. Okay, that's the important thing. If there was studies done that show that, those that reclaim slurs on some independent measure, they show that they exhibit more self-hatred than those that don't reclaim slurs, for example, right? Well, then we have some empirical support for this claim. But what we can't do is just assume that this is the right view without any data to support it and other data that is counter to this claim, okay? So starting at a neutral position where we're just trying to learn how slurs are used, right? Imagine we're coming from a different planet and we're trying to figure out how are these words used by humans, right? Well, from that approach, we're just gathering data and we see, well, the N-word, when it has a negative usage by these speakers in these contexts, but it has a different meaning and understood usage by other members in other contexts, okay? And This will help us develop a more nuanced, informative account. Okay. In that, if I was to take this account of slurs back to my alien planet, the account that explains in-group and out-group usage and not just out-group usage will be more informative for my alien comrades, right? They'll have a better understanding of not just how those words work, but also of our social behavior. That reclamation is something that's possible among humans in cultures and whatnot. Okay. And that meaning is something that's often contested and renegotiated over time. Okay. All right. So methodologically, our theories should be based on data. We should continue to refine our theories with new data that comes in, and our theories should have some predictive or explanatory power. Okay. And insofar as we're committed to saying slurs are just always bad and are never reclaimed, well, then that theory doesn't have explanatory power. As we'll see tomorrow in the lecture for tomorrow, right, the reappropriation of stigmatizing labels by Galinsky and colleagues, 2013, we'll see that slurs are reappropriated or reclaimed in that article, in that experimental article. In order to predict any of those results, right, we have to acknowledge and have some understanding of reclamation. Okay. All right, so the article that we read for today was by Rahman, 2012, titled "The N-Word, Its History and Use in the African American Community." And this article was published in the Journal of English Linguistics. This is a nice article on the N-word. It'll give us an understanding of the different usages of the N-word, as well as how linguists in general study slurs, right? You could use this as a model for how you might carry out an independent study project. So we have seen that the N-word has diverse uses rather than a singular usage. So one of the goals of linguists is to investigate the various usages. In this study, Rahman examined 8 hours of stand-up comedy performances from 9 well-known African-American comedians to better understand the social meanings and contexts of use for the N-word. Popular comedy performances such as these both reflect the historical and current usage of the N-word and also influence future usage of the N-word. Okay, so you might ask, why are we looking at stand-up comedy, right? Well, one is that stand-up comedy provides a nice opportunity to discuss taboo or otherwise undiscussable topics, right? So things like race, ethnicity, bad words, whereas these are hard to discuss in everyday situations, right? We need sort of like privileged spaces to discuss these without getting into arguments and fights, right? One of the safe spaces is in the lecture hall or in the classroom, like what we're doing. Another safe space is going to be in a comedy club, okay? And it's because when we enter these spaces, like the classroom or in the comedy club, we know that what we're doing is for the sake of learning or laughter and not for the sake of hurting each other or something of that nature. Okay. So stand-up comedy is a nice place to hear African Americans discuss aspects of their daily lives, right? Stand-up comedy, it's common for stand-up comedy performers to discuss their lives, right? What they are getting into, their trials and tribulations and whatnot. Okay, so by observing stand-up comedy performances by African Americans, we can gain some insight into their lives, their trials and tribulations, words, their understanding, their social understanding of words and whatnot. Okay, so Also, I want to point out that not only does stand-up comedy give us insight into the meanings of slurs, it also, stand-up comedy performances and other forms of popular media, because they're so widely accessible and watched, they also help to influence future usages. Okay. So, for example, when we all watch a popular performance by Eddie Griffin or by Richard Pryor, we not only learn how they understand words, we also adopt their usage or allow their usage to influence our usage, right? Like, oh, okay, well, I know that Richard Pryor, D.L. Hughley understand the N-word to mean this, so now I will understand the N-word to mean something like this as well, okay? Or something to that effect, okay? So popular media serve both to inform, but also establish a sort of convention or guideline for the future, for future usages. So Rahman investigated these stand-up comedy performances, and here's a table. In table 3, we see a list of the comedians and their performances. Rahman analyzed these performances for usages of the N-word and other forms of marking ethnic identity, and then investigated whether that usage was derogatory or non-derogatory, whether it was used positively or negatively, and so on. Okay. Furthermore, Rahman also interviewed 4 African-American individuals that were knowledgeable in African-American English, or AAE. Okay, and these participants were between the ages of 22 and 66 years old. And African-American English, or AAE, is often also considered Black English, African-American Vernacular English, or AAVE, AAE, Ebonics. So this can go by different names, okay? In this lecture, I'll call it AAE, okay? But in some of my other writing, I call it African-American Vernacular English, and you'll notice that in the literature, others like McWhorter will call it Black English, and just understand that we're referencing the same thing, okay? And it's just because what's appropriate or the ideal terminology, it changes over time, and we adjust and try to adopt the best, most suitable terminology, okay? So for today, I'll just use AAE. All right, so what did Rahman find from her study, looking at 8 hours of stand-up comedy and discussing language use with 4 African Americans that were highly competent in AAE? What do we understand about the N-word? Well, table 1 shows that the N-word is the most frequently used term of address and reference, conveying ethnic meaning in stand-up comedy performances. So we see here in table 1 that although different words can be used as terms of address and reference, that the N-word is the most frequently used for the term of address and reference. Okay, so we see that it's used 254 times, whereas, right, brother, sister, 17 times. Okay. Additionally, in table 2, we see that, well, table 2 shows that the N-word is the most frequently used ethnic term to convey solidarity in stand-up comedy performances. So when we're thinking about terms that are used to convey solidarity in stand-up comedy, we see that different terms are used, such as brother, girl, but the term that is used most frequently to convey solidarity is also the N-word, okay, which is highly surprising, right? Especially for those that think of the N-word as having almost exclusively a derogatory meaning, we see here that 36.9% of the time that stand-up comedians are using words to convey solidarity, they're using the N-word, okay? So importantly, we see from these results that the N-word does not have a purely derogatory or negative meaning, right? We see here that the story is more complex than that, and that in some cases it's used to convey solidarity. So again, now what we're doing is we're just sort of adding some data that supports the firsthand reports from Kennedy, Asim, and other African-American scholars, okay? So we already have books by scholars that have reported non-derogatory usages of the N-word, okay? And now instead of firsthand reports, now we're just getting data, all right? So Rahman did a study analyzing stand-up comedy and also interviewed participants. And now we have data, right, that supports these previous firsthand reports. Okay, so we're accumulating evidence for something like non-derogatory usages of the N-word. Okay, and this is just further reinforcing the importance of studying non-derogatory usages and incorporating our understanding of non-derogatory usages into our understanding of slur usage more generally. Okay. And you'll see that this is why all my articles on slurs, well, a good majority of my articles on slurs have as a subtitle, right? It'll say like, it'll have a title, but then it'll say like derogatory and appropriative, an account of their derogatory and reclaimed usages, okay? It's important that my account can explain both usages, okay? So Rahman is going to offer some explanation for these two different usages. Rahman suggests that the pejorative or derogatory meanings for the N-word historically come from outside the African American community. Okay, so from out-group members. Rahman suggests that the N-word produced with an R, a post-vocalic R, right, instead of a schwa, is associated with negative subhuman characteristics. Okay, so as a shorthand, instead of saying post-vocalic R instead of a schwa, I'll just say the N-word with an R or the N-word with an A. Okay, just to make it a little bit easier. Okay, less cumbersome to say over the lecture. Okay, so Rahman suggests that the N-word produced with an R is associated with negative subhuman characteristics. Rahman further suggests that this form of the N-word with the R is typically used in disapproval and for symbolic or physical violence. Okay, so we see that the pejorative meaning of the N-word comes from non-African Americans being used towards African Americans, right, in contexts in which negative characteristics are being indexed, and this usage is being used for the purposes of disapproval or for symbolic and physical violence. Okay. So that is, on the one hand, the paradigm derogatory usage of the N-word. Okay. And we see here, right, that just throughout the history of slavery, that African Americans were treated with great brutality and violence, physical as well as verbal violence. Okay. And so we can see here a slave being whipped, right? Flogging a slave fastened to the ground. This is just brutal, right? Horrible. And we see the markings on the back from that. And in a way, the slur, the N-word, is something like a whipping, right? It's sort of like a symbolic version of this flogging or whipping, right? To have an N-word used against you is in some sense to bear these scars on the back, okay? At least the pejorative usage, okay? So think, we can think about this version of the N word, who's using it and in what contexts, okay? And we see that it's non-in-group member, so an out-group member in context of physical and symbolic violence, okay? And indexing negative characteristics. So usually when people are using the N-word in a derogatory manner, they tend to communicate or index something negative about these individuals, okay? And it doesn't have to be a negative characteristic that they in fact have, but one that they're presumed to have based on negative stereotypes and prejudices against them, okay? Like a common stereotype would be unintellectual, for example, right? So you might use the N-word to index or to communicate that a target is unintellectual, regardless of whether that's true or not, okay? The usage of the word is meant to index that, right? And also to hurt that target, okay? And not just this target as an individual, for example, as Bob or as John, right? But to hurt this target as a member of that ethnic or racial group, okay? African Americans, for example, for today. Importantly, the N-word also has non-pejorative meanings. And Rahman suggests that the non-pejorative meanings for the N-word historically come from inside the African American community. Rahman suggests that the N-word produced with an A instead of an R is associated with positive characteristics, such as being a survivor. Okay, this is what Rahman considers the core meaning of the N-word. Okay. Rahman suggests that this form of the N-word is produced with a schwa instead of a post-vocalic R, and is used for approval or self-empowerment. And so here we see that the non-pejorative meaning or the positive meaning, right, has a different sound, right? There's a different articulation in the pronunciation of this word, which signals the distinct version of this word. And also it's used in a non-pejorative way by different speakers, right? In this case, in-group speakers, other fellow African Americans, okay? And the context in which this is used also tends to be in context of approval and self-empowerment, okay? So we're starting to see some systematic differences here. On the one hand, out-group members indexing negative characteristics for the purposes of harming, okay? On the other hand, we have in-group members indexing positive characteristics for the purposes of helping or supporting, right? Two very different contexts, speakers, and intended meanings, okay? And of course, as we continue through the course, we'll see that the things can get a little bit more complicated, right? We can have people of mixed identity. We can have contexts that are not so clear cut. But what we're doing is we're starting with clear cases. And then as we build a model from clear cases, we can then refine and tune based on these more complicated cases, okay? But to make things clear, we see that there's some systematic differences already in terms of articulation or pronunciation, speakers or group membership in contexts of usage, okay? Rahman further suggests that the inaccessibility that slaveholders had to the survival meaning of the N-word made it a useful tool in the counter language that developed within the context of the slave anti-society, okay? In general, the idea here is that this alternate version of the word is useful in the counter language in the counter society. According to Rahman, a counter language was used among slaves for at least two purposes. One, to provide a discrete mode of communication, and two, to provide a means to project a social face that resisted unjust domination. Okay, so this counter language is both sort of like a secret code way of speaking to other in-group members, but also a way to preserve our social face. Okay. And we see, for example, here that non-pejorative uses of the N-word can be found in music, stand-up comedy, and other forms of popular media today. Okay, and here I just use this as an example. The title of the song is My N, right? My N-word. Rahman suggests that individuals that use elements of the grammatical, phonological, and lexical systems of a shared dialect with others can contribute to feelings of familiarity, shared cultural experiences, and solidarity. Okay, so language is not just about communicating facts and information, right? Like in a scientific manner, but it's also to express in-groupness, right? When I'm talking to you, I'm not just giving you facts, but I'm also letting you know that I'm also a fellow Californian, right? When I'm talking to you, I'm letting you know that not just like that I believe this or that this is true, but also that I'm part of you, right? Like I'm part of the same group as you, or I'm part of a different group than you, right? And so we can understand social identity through language usage. Okay. So discussing this point here, because we'll see that the in-group usage of the N-word, right, is the in-group usage of the N-word follows principles from AAE, okay, or African American English, okay, or the dialect for many African American speakers in the United States, okay. So we see that it's not random that the N-word, the in-group usage is R-less, whereas the out-group usage has an R, right? That's not random or haphazard, but rather it makes sense, right? Because speakers of AAE systematically adopt R-lessness in their speech, we can understand that the R-less version of the N-word, right, is more consistent with AAE. And the version of the N-word that has an R is less consistent with AAE. So the version that's R-less is less offensive than the version with the R. Okay, so that's what I'm going to discuss that here in the next few slides. Okay. So the phonological system of African American English, or AAE, has a rule that can produce a schwa instead of a post-vocalic R in an unstressed final syllable. Okay, so instead of father, father. Okay, or instead of flavor, flava. Okay, and a lot of speech sounds, vernacular speech sounds like this, right? We don't always hyper articulate our R's. Okay. So if we're saying flava, right, instead of flavor, right, this is called R-lessness. The form of the N-word produced with a or a schwa instead of a R is more consistent with African American English compared to the form of the N-word produced with an R. Accordingly, this form of the N-word is considered less offensive compared to the form of the N-word produced with an R, okay, which is the out-group version with outgroup pronunciation, pejorative meaning, and negative outcomes. Whereas the version with the A, right, R-less version, is more associated with the in-group version, with in-group pronunciation, non-pejorative meanings, and positive outcomes. Some scholars have been extremely critical of African-American English, going so far as to claim that it is not a legitimate language variety. For example, the journalist William Raspberry claimed that African-American English has, quote, no right or wrong expressions, no consistent spellings or pronunciations, and no discernible rules. Of course, that's false, right? That's clearly false. So Natalie Schilling, an associate professor of linguistics at Georgetown, for example, argues that such criticisms of African-American English are misguided and grounded on a misunderstanding of dialect variation in general and of African-American English in particular. Natalie Schilling, John McWhorter, and other sociolinguists have argued that African-American English has a distinctive lexicon and distinct rules for pronunciation, grammar, and conversation. The pronunciation patterns in African-American English are not sloppy or idiosyncratic, but are rather systematic and rule-governed. And importantly, this is what we want from a language, right? This is what is important to a language, right? The important thing about a language is not the particular rules that it has, but the fact that it's rule-based and systematic. Okay, that's the important thing about a language, okay, is that languages are systematic, okay, and rule-based, not idiosyncratic. So insofar as AAE is also systematic and rule-based, it's also a genuine, full-fledged language, regardless of if it's similar to other dialects or languages, okay? In other words, just because AAE isn't SAE, Standard American English, right? Just because the rules are different doesn't mean that it's not a dialect or a language, okay? And real quick, if you're wondering what the distinction is between a dialect and a language, English is one language, okay? We can have different dialects of English, like African American English, Standard American English, okay? These are different dialects of English, right? And why these are different dialects of the same language is because if I speak AAE and you speak SAE, we can still understand each other, okay? We can still communicate, although our rules will be slightly different, okay? If we speak different languages, then we can't communicate with each other, right? If I'm speaking Korean and you're speaking English, then there's no communication going on between us yet. But if I'm speaking AAE and you're speaking SAE, we can still communicate in English, okay? Even though you might think that, you might think, my English is too vernacular or informal. And I might think the opposite, like, you're, too uptight and too formal, okay? So that's the difference between a language and a dialect, okay? The point here is that some have suggested that AAE is not a legitimate dialect or language because it's not SAE, it's not Standard American English. Okay, and what I'm trying to point out here, and what other sociolinguists are pointing out here, is that this is incorrect. Okay, we need to first ask, does AAE have systematic rules? And if AAE is fully systematic and rule-based, then it's just as much of a legitimate dialect as SAE or any other dialect. Okay, and here we see that R-lessness is rule-based and not sloppy or idiosyncratic. Okay, so for example, William Raspberry is wrong here because William Raspberry says that there's no right or wrong expressions, right? You can just do whatever you want with R's in AAE, which is clearly false, right? So we see that acceptable applications of R-lessness in AAE would be, for example, flavor instead of flavor, or father instead of father, or mother instead of mother. Okay. But what's not acceptable is bing instead of bring, or price instead of price. Okay. So we see that it's R-lessness, or dropping the R, is acceptable when R occurs at the end, right? It's not acceptable when R occurs somewhere else in the middle. Okay. And if you're interested in studying this, right, you're free to, as a research paper, investigate when is it appropriate to drop the R and when is it not. Okay, but here the important point for this slide is just that we see you can't just drop the R wherever you want, but that there's a systematic or rule-based way in which we can drop the R. Okay, and speakers of AAE are applying this rule systematically whenever they're applying R-lessness. All right, and you can hear this very nicely in speakers of British English when they say things like representation. So I was listening to a lecture by a British professor of linguistics, and when the R is in the final position, like X bar, right? Sometimes the R will be soft, right? Or other words where the R is at the end, it'll be soft. But when it's in the beginning, like representation, they definitely don't drop the R there, right? So we see that R-lessness, although it is a feature of Black English or African American English, it's not only a feature of Black English or African American English. That R-lessness is also a feature of British English, as well as English in other parts of the United States. Okay, so you think about some of the posh accents used in Downton Abbey. Okay, so something like Carter, right? Professor Carter, you might say Carter, right? But the British English, they don't say Carter, right? It's more like Carter, right? Carter, right? Or corner, right? Corner, right? Corner. And order, 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 right? Of course, my British accent is horrible, right? But you see what I'm trying to do, and what proper British English speakers do well, okay, is that they're dropping the R, right? Carter, corner, order, okay, instead of Carter, corner, order, Carter, corner, order. Okay. So when you hear proper British English, you're going to hear them dropping the R too. And we don't assume that this is because they're lazy or they're intellectually inferior, right? Notice that the R-lessness is part of the speech of the upper class here, right? It's part of the posh accents used. So we see that although some have suggested that R-lessness is a sign of laziness or being an anti-intellectual, here we see that that can't possibly be the case, because even upper class royalty in England, as well as professors of linguistics in the UK, right, they will also use R-lessness. And it can't be because they're lower class, because the upper class use it. And it can't be because they're unintelligent, because professors of linguistics, right, adopt R-lessness as well. Okay, because this is part of the speech in their linguistic communities. Okay, it has nothing to do with whether you're smart or not. It has to do with whether this is the way speakers in your community pronounce things. And we see that in England, for example, in East Anglia, Essex, and Kent, that they pronounce words without an R at the end, or at least they apply R-lessness in these cases. Okay. So, because royalty and professors apply R-lessness in these cases, right? This is the way the upper class and professors will speak. Okay. In the United States, we also find R-lessness in different regions, including Boston, Massachusetts, Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City, New York. Okay. And if you want to hear some great examples, go ahead and Google, Downton Abbey pronunciation. Listen to some nice British English. Okay. And it'll help clarify the pronunciation for you. So importantly, speakers that say Carter are not more intelligent or less intelligent or better or worse than speakers that say Kata. Rather, different systems or rules for pronunciation simply communicate different sociolinguistic identities. And again, I just want to point out that because a speaker adopts R-lessness in their speech doesn't mean that they're unintelligent or super intelligent. Okay, it may have nothing to do with intelligence at all, but rather indexes the social, ethnic, or other type of community that they belong to. Okay. All right. In the 1960s, William Labov, another very important sociolinguist from the University of Pennsylvania, investigated R-lessness in people shopping at different department stores in New York. So the different department stores included Saks, which is the most expensive store, Macy's, which was the average store, and Klein's, which was a discount store. Okay, so we have stores of different expense levels which sort of index different levels of affluence for the shoppers, right? You're going to have the most affluent shoppers at Saks, like the middle class at Macy's, and the lower class at Klein's. Okay. In this study, Labov wanted to investigate R-lessness in these different department stores, right? You might wonder, okay, well, if R-lessness might be used to index social group, then maybe there's a different usage of R-lessness in shoppers at the most expensive stores versus shoppers at the least expensive stores, right? And so that was sort of the hypothesis Labov had. And so he wanted to investigate this. So in this study, Labov found that people were more R-less in the least expensive store, Klein's, and people were less R-less in the most expensive store, Saks. And what he did is he just asked people in the store. So basically, first, Labov went to the fourth floor on these different stores. And, imagine that there's like shoes on the fourth floor. Okay. Then he would ask people, like, where are the shoes? And then the people would have to say, like, they're on the fourth floor. Right. And then Labov would annotate or have students annotate whether they pronounced fourth floor with an R, right, or without the R, R-less. Okay. And by hypothesis, if you ask people, hey, where are the shoes? You ask them at Saks, you ask them at Macy's, you ask them at Klein's, they're all going to say, oh, on the fourth floor, on the fourth floor. But by hypothesis, we should get more R's in one store and less R's in another store, depending on their class, right? The social class. At least that's the hypothesis in this research. And Labov found that this was the case, that there was more R-lessness, right? More usage of R. I'm sorry, there's more R-less, less usage of R in the least expensive store, right? So in the cheapest store, Klein's, there was a lot of R-lessness. Okay, so they dropped the R a lot. But in the most expensive store, right, the upper class one, they used R's more. So R-lessness was found less in those most expensive stores. Okay, so when you go to an upper class store, you're hearing more R's, more pronunciations of the R's. But the lower class store, you're getting less R's, more casual speech in the lower class store, more formal speech in the upper class stores. Okay, which is a very interesting result. This might be a study that you would try to replicate, right? Maybe you want to go to South Carolina or Boston and see if you can also find systematic differences in pronunciation based on a hypothesis, right? Like social class or ethnicity or so on. Okay. So what this study shows is that R-lessness often indexes social and class status. John McWhorter also points out that with pairs of words that refer to the same thing, the R-less version is usually more vernacular and less formal. So for example, we have curse and cuss, right? Curse this, or right, maybe you heard someone curse at church, right? But you cussed out the guy at the store, right? So curse sounds more formal. Cuss is a little bit more casual. And the difference is just whether it has an R or not. Similarly, girl and gal, right? They both mean about the same thing, but girl has a more formal quality or sound to it, whereas gal is a little bit more informal. Okay, so we just see that there is this sort of understanding at some level of R-lessness being more informal and vernacular, and R, the usage of R, being more formal and less vernacular. All right, so beyond just our R-lessness, we have some other features, linguistic features that we want to discuss today. So another well-studied linguistic feature is verb aspect, which concerns how an action takes place. Unconjugated or invariant be is of this form: she be working on weekends. Okay, so you might think, it doesn't sound good, that's ungrammatical. Okay, but this is a systematic form in AAE. Okay, and what unconjugated or invariant be means is that the agent here, she, is doing this regularly or habitually. Okay, so if I say she working today, that means she's just working today, right? Maybe she usually doesn't work today, but she got called in to work today, so she working today, right? But if I say she be working on weekends, that's used to indicate that she does this regularly or habitually, right? Maybe it's been part of her routine schedule for the last 30 years that she works every weekend. Maybe she's a nurse, right? So she'd be working on weekends. Okay, regular or habitual action here. Okay, so again, this unconjugated or invariant be in African American English is not used in a sloppy or haphazard manner, but rather is reserved for a specific kind of meaning to express a habitual or recurring action. Okay. In non-habitual contexts, the be is conjugated or omitted. So for example, like I mentioned, she working today, right? She could be, that means she's working today, but not regularly or habitually, right? And so here we're seeing that AAE has a pretty complex usage of verb aspect. Okay. Also, she come talking that noise. Here, come is used to mark indignation. Okay, and so here we just see that AAE has a rich usage of verb aspect, even more so than standard American English. Okay, Under careful linguistic analysis, we see that AAE is a full-fledged, rule-governed, and intricately patterned linguistic system with distinctive features at all levels of language. In fact, AAE has a more intricate verb tense and aspect system than SAE, or Standard American English. So here we see that AAE, African American English, is more systematic in subject-verb agreement than Standard American English. So here we see that up here we have Standard American English agreement system for regular verbs. And so we see that there's the first, second, and third person singular, as well as the first, second, and third person plural. Okay. And we see for Standard American English, it goes, I go, you go, he goes, we go, y'all go, they go. Okay, so there's nice consistency across all 6 of these, except for here, right? I go, you go, we go, y'all go, they go, he goes. So this is a little idiosyncratic here, okay? But notice that in AAE, African American English, we have a nicer agreement system for regular verbs, right? So here we have I go, you go, he go, we go, y'all go, they go. All right. So although it may sound weird or unintuitive to us at first to say something like he go to the store, right? You might say, that's ungrammatical. Notice that that's only from the standpoint of assuming Standard American English as a default, right? But if we're thinking about African American English as a default, that's perfectly acceptable. And if we're choosing between systems, agreement systems for regular verbs, we see that AAE is actually more parsimonious than SAE. And in general, when we're thinking about what systems to adopt in terms of theoretical systems, Occam's razor suggests that we should adopt the most elegant or parsimonious one, right? So we don't want scientific theories to be unnecessarily complex. Similarly, our rule system for language shouldn't be unnecessarily complex like we see here, right? But rather should be more uniform across all instances, right? And we see that here, comparing SAE and AAE, that AAE is more consistent in its agreement system for regular verbs, okay? And another case, the verb to be is also more systematic in African American English than in Standard American English. So we see that here we have the verb to be in Standard American English. And again, this is in the first, second, and third person singular, as well as the first, second, and third person plural, okay? Here we have I was, you were, she was, we were, y'all were, they were, okay? And the verb to be in African American English is I was, you was, he was, we was, y'all was, they was, okay? So again, notice that the verb to be is much more consistent and uniform in AAE and less so in Standard American English. So we can say something like you were, we were, y'all were, they were. But then I have to say I was and she was, right? Like you were late, we were late, y'all were late, they were late. I was late, she was late, right? It's not elegant. It's not as consistent. But notice that in AAE, it's consistent. I just use was for all of them. I was late, you was late, he was late, we was late, y'all was late, they was late, okay? So even though, because many of us, especially in an academic context, we're starting with Standard American English as a default setting, right? Like for what sounds proper to our ears. So at first we might think, right, you was late, that doesn't sound good. But upon reflection, we see that this is actually the more consistent system, right? And insofar as we prefer the most elegant, parsimonious systems, right? There's some compelling evidence or reasons to suggest that AAE is more preferable to SAE. Okay. And this is based on arguments that we should welcome as scientists, right? In general, if I have two hypotheses or two models to explain the same phenomenon, I'm going to adopt the one that's the most parsimonious, right? For example, in order to explain the movement of the stars based on the hypothesis that the Earth is the center of the universe, we've got to draw many more epicycles to account for our observations of the planets, right? Whereas if we assume that the Earth is one of several planets that revolves around the sun, right? Then we have to draw less epicycles, right? And we're able to explain our observations with a simpler model, right? And that's why at some point we ditched the model of the Earth as the center of the universe and instead adopted the view that the Earth is not the center of the universe, right? It's because we were at that point adopting a more elegant, simpler model, right? The one that was most parsimonious to explain all of the effects or data. Similarly, right, we want the system that does the most work with the least amount of parts, okay, explanatory parts. And here it seems like AAE is a good system, okay. All right, so we covered quite a bit today. So what did we do today? Well, today we reviewed conventions for the professional study of slurs. Okay, so how we will conduct ourselves throughout the course. We're going to make sure to be very professional. During our YouTube lectures, we will exercise extreme caution, right? And either heavily contextualize your usage of slurs or replace them with alternatives for our online presentations. When we're writing research papers and publications, we especially focusing on the semantics or history of these different words, we want to make sure that we write the full words out, right? At least once, so that we can capture any important differences that we want to capture, like the difference between the N word with the R or the N word with an A, for example. Okay. We want to be careful to mention, but not to use slurs. Okay. So I'm not calling anyone any slurs in this course. I'm not saying you're this or you're that, but rather we're discussing how slurs are used, right? Like Kennedy reports that this slur is understood this way, or Rahman, found that slurs are understood that way, and so on. Okay. So we're like reporters, right? Where we mention slurs without using them. Okay. Like I can mention how someone said I do without me also getting married in my report of someone else saying I do. Okay. So we discussed some important professional aspects of research on slurs. We also saw that there's not a single uniform usage of this slur, but rather there are at least two distinct usages. One use of the N-word originates from outside the African-American community, has negative pejorative meanings, and is typically used in disapproval and for symbolic or physical violence. This use of the N-word is typically produced with an R instead of an A, which is inconsistent with African-American English. Another use of the N-word originates from within the African-American community, has positive, non-pejorative meanings, and is typically used in approval and for self-empowerment. This use of the N-word is typically produced with an A instead of an R, which is consistent with African-American English. In how to do things with slurs, studies in the way of derogatory words, I suggest the following, right? So the N-word with features with this feature from AAE or AAVE equals this version of the slur. Okay. In other words, by adding features of the in-group language, we make the slur that targets that group less offensive or less derogatory. Okay. Another way to think about this is the more you substitute out-group properties and contexts for in-group properties and contexts, the less offensive and derogatory you make the slur. Okay. So for example, imagine I could like replace speaker qualities, language properties, and contextual properties like piece by piece, right? Well, if I replace out-group member with in-group member, that helps to make the slur less offensive. If I replace out-group dialect with in-group dialect, that also makes the use less offensive, okay? If I make the context more in-group like, less out-group like, I further make the slur less offensive. And you see, just the more I make this an in-group context amongst in-group members, right, I will make this less offensive. And the more I make this an out-group context with an out-group member, right, with out-group dialects and whatnot, I'll make it more offensive. Okay, so here, what I'm trying to do here is, instead of saying that the N-word is always and only offensive, or the N-word is always and only positive, I'm trying to go from this all or nothing, right, switch to more of like a dial where we can say, okay, given these properties, let's move it more to the in-group use. Given these other properties, move it back to the out-group use, okay? And this way we can have a sort of more nuanced, fine-grained model for explaining how slurs can be either more or less offensive, okay? And I think this is capturing what we've been reviewing in previous work, right? Like my model and my view is, the purpose of it is to capture all of the data about slurs, okay? Whereas other views, I feel, did not do a good job of accounting for all of the phenomena. In particular, we saw Fitton just simply reject out of hand all in-group usages as forms of self-hatred, okay? Instead of adopting that view a priori, the approach here is based on the data that we are finding, trying to construct a model that fits those findings, okay? So that's why I suggest this right here, okay? And this seems intuitively correct, okay? Today, we also saw that AAE is not inferior or superior to SAE, right? African American English is not better or worse, more intelligent or less intelligent than standard American English or other varieties of English for that matter, right? Instead, we saw that different language varieties communicate different sociolinguistic identities. So even myself, right? I have a PhD in linguistics, but sometimes, right, if I'm just hanging out with certain friends, I'll go R-less, right? I'll be very vernacular and colloquial and informal, okay? And in fact, that's probably most of my speech, right? However, if I'm giving a professional lecture, or if I'm meeting colleagues for the first time, right, in order to index or convey my social identity as a professor that is well aware of the conventions of standard American English, I may modify my speech pattern to communicate my group membership, not necessarily my intelligence, okay? Because again, even when I'm speaking informally, I still have a PhD in linguistics. It doesn't make me less intelligent for speaking that way. I'm just communicating different things about group membership, okay? Like when I'm at the jazz bar or just hanging out with my friends, it would actually be unintelligent to hyper articulate my R's, right? I would in some sense not be incorporating myself into my environment, my social environment in the appropriate way if I'm overemphasizing my R's, right? Like at a bar with my friends at like 2:30 in the morning. Okay. In those contexts, I got to chill with the R and I got to go informal. Okay. That's even the more appropriate thing to do in that situation. Okay. So again, we saw in this lecture that AAE, SAE, this is not about intellect, superior or inferior intellect, but about communicating group membership, right, in different groups. And we even saw that certain upper class, highly intelligent groups will be R-less. Okay, so this is a very contextual issue here in, right, like in certain places of the world at certain times, pronouncing your R is considered intelligent, whereas in other places in the world at other times, not pronouncing the R is intelligent. Okay, so this is a not an absolute thing, but a contextually sensitive issue. Okay. Kuplan, for example, suggests that our personal identities are collages of different social category characteristics. So I'm both a professor, but I'm also a Californian, right? I'm also kind of young and also a musician and a martial artist, right? And so you see that different parts of my identity are going to pull me in different directions, right? Maybe multiple times in the same day. So I might teach a class in the morning where I'm indexing my identity as an academic, and then I might go do a Muay Thai session where I'm going to be more informal, and then I might give another lecture where I'm formal again, and then I might go hang out at the evening with my friends and be informal once again, right? So we see that the presence and absence of R, even in one individual, can change many times throughout a single day. Okay. Interestingly, we saw that R-lessness can be used to index different identities, such as that of African Americans in the USA, the upper class in England, and still others. So, importantly, different sociolinguistic identities will not rely on one linguistic feature alone, but will be communicated using different lexicons and different systems or rules for pronunciation, grammar, and conversation. One of the fun things that we do as sociolinguists is sort of think about like the system, right, that a particular group uses to communicate their sociolinguistic identity. And of course, it won't be just whether they have R's or not, but a collection of rules or features, right? All right, so that covers the main points of our lecture today, covering both the professional study of slurs, the in-group and out-group usages of slurs, as well as the different in-group and out-group dialects of speakers. Okay, and in the lecture today, we saw that by applying an in-group dialect to a slur, this can help index the in-group variant or version of the slur, the version which is reclaimed, the version which has a more positive meaning. Okay. So I hope that you found this lecture on the N-word interesting, and I want to thank you for your attention today. Tomorrow, we will continue our discussion of the in-group use of language by looking at how slurs or stigmatizing labels can be reclaimed or reappropriated. Okay. Once again, thank you for your attention today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.